Hi, Dale.
Hello, Bob. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, Meaning of Life TV. You're Dale Wright. So far as we know, we're not related.
So far as we know, but we
You
know
know,
we are.
we've only just started talking. Who knows? You are a Gamble Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies and Asian Studies at Occidental College. You've written a number of books on Buddhism, most recently this one, What is Buddhist Enlightenment?
Right.
Very interesting book. And many of us would like to know what enlightenment is, I'm sure, and so you're just the person for us to talk to.
So,
Um, the and
well, one thing we may share as rights is a genetic predisposition to audacious book titles.
It's funny. I've got another one coming that's about Buddhism. We won't get into that,
Okay.
but it's more audacious than your title. We'll
Well,
talk about it after the taping.
okay.
It'll be out in August, and it's going to make yours seem unambitious.
Yeah. Okay.
But yours is ambitious enough to talk about what enlightenment is. I think most people know that enlightenment is this thing that is said to be kind of the culmination of the Buddhist path, and the book raises a lot of interesting questions about it. Obviously, what the hell is it for starters? But also, it raises questions about where kind of modern Buddhism may be headed in practice and in aspiration and in ideal. Also raises a very interesting question of does enlightenment attain moral goodness? You tell the very interesting story of this kind of Zen master bad boy, you might say.
Yes.
This Maizumi Roshi, who played a big role in bringing Zen to the United States. He was a founder of the Zen Center of Los Angeles. He had a proclivity for drinking heavily and engaging in sex, sometimes with students. And there was a big scandal and so on. And we'll get into that, and because I'm very interested in the question of, and there are differing opinions on this. I've talked to different people, meditation teachers and so on, and I've talked to people who say they've attained enlightenment. And they don't think that a strict moral code should be part of the deal. So we'll talk about all this.
Okay.
For starters, since a lot of people watching or listening to this may not have taken even Buddhism 101. Before we get into what you say about enlightenment, what do you think is kind of the capsulized common encyclopedia or even dictionary kind of definition? I mean, what is enlightenment kind of thought to connote? I know it's a really complicated question. I mean, that's part of the point of your book in a way. But what do you think? If you go to Wikipedia or wherever and just first two sentences, what do you think enlightenment is thought to be?
Okay. Yeah. Well, the thesis of the book is that there's a huge and complicated history here where enlightenment turns into different things over time in different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
But the Wikipedia version, which of course I don't know, but is that enlightenment is an awakening of consciousness that entails the ability to see and comprehend more than one could before. It usually is taken to be a fulfillment of the whole human being, including the moral sphere, where you become morally impeccable and have attained a state of humanity that is evolutionarily beyond others, so that you understand what others don't really understand, and you're able to embody that in an actual life.
Mm-hmm. And is it easy to capsulize what it is you understand, or the nature of what you understand, the nature of the insight you have that others don't?
No, but in fact, it's quite impossible. But there are a couple basic principles in Buddhism that seem simple and are simple, but once you explode them out into larger versions of themselves, become rich and complicated. Buddhist principle of impermanence, that Buddhists say basically we know that things change, but we don't really know that. We don't really understand that, and we live as though that's not true. Right. We haven't really taken that into account. And a second Buddhist principle called dependent arising means everything is related to other things. Nothing stands on its own. Nothing has an essence of its own. Everything is what it is in the context of other things, helping to make it be that way. Buddhist idea of no self, that like everything else, a human being is impermanent, always changing, and relative to other factors, contextual, circumstantial, historical. So those are very basic, simple ideas, but to have a really profound understanding of those is essential to what Buddhist enlightenment is about.
And is thought to be kind of transformative. But I think we should add that there is this emphasis on not merely conceptual understanding of these things, but kind of experiential understanding, and that's where the meditative practice comes in. So you actually come to appreciate something like impermanence, the impermanence of even your own interior life, your thoughts, your feelings. You see all this at a higher resolution is the idea, and then for reasons that probably aren't clear to people who have just been listening and haven't thought about this much, for reasons that may not be clear, this is said to be transformative and change the kind of person you are. If you really become convinced, okay, there is no self in me, everything out there is really so interdependent with other things that it's almost misleading to think of the things out there as things in their own right. Things like that. It's easy enough to say them and even understand what they mean, but it is said to be the case that if you really get the picture experientially, you're this totally different kind of person.
Yeah, that's right. And Buddhists break the self, or who we are, the human person, down into 5 basic components, and the thinking rational part is only one of 5. So to have a full humane awakening is to awaken yourself in terms of feeling and perception, ability to be mindful of what you're perceiving, and other spheres as well. So yeah, far beyond the conceptual, although the conceptual is part of it.
Yeah. Now, just quickly, we might as well establish that in a certain strict sense of the term, the word enlightenment is I don't want to say mistranslation of the original Buddhist term, but it's a slightly westernization of the term, right? What is the term actually? What does enlightenment actually derive from in the original ancient Pali or Sanskrit?
Yeah, well, a number of basic terms. Nirvana, of course, which means a form of extinction of greed, hatred, delusion. But Bodhi is maybe the most basic term, and it means an awakening. Right. So to wake up. So the difference between me sleeping and me coming awake, you realize, all of those images were just dreams. So those are essential. There are many others.
And isn't Bodhi kind of the term that has been taken to be equated with enlightenment, whereas the more literal meaning would be awakening?
Yes, a literal translation of Bodhi would be awakening, to wake up. Right. That's right, yeah. There's a Chinese symbol, Ming, which literally means enlightenment, where light comes on. And the metaphors are similar, right? Enlightenment, the light sheds, you see things, you wake up, you see what's true. So there's a similarity. But enlightenment became a term in Buddhism only in the Age of Enlightenment, when scholars were trying to understand Buddhism, and they tried to find a word in Western languages, Aufklärung in German and Enlightenment in English, in other words, that really gave a sense of what Buddhism was about. They chose Enlightenment even though it wasn't a direct translation of what's going on in Sanskrit or Chinese or Tibetan.
Okay. And I think it's apt enough. I mean, the idea behind awakening, to more literally translate the term Bodhi, and of course that's the basis for the term the Buddha, Bodhi, yeah. Buddha, awakened one, is that you are enlightened. You see things much more clearly. You see to the core of things. Okay, so as a practical matter, as you note, the term has meant a lot of different things in a lot of different traditions. Now, you clearly have probably thought most about Zen, just looking at your work over the course of your career. It occupies a fair amount of this book. And I think it'd be good to talk about Zen because, for one thing, oddly, it hasn't gotten as much press lately. I mean, on the one hand, Zen is kind of it is the version of Buddhism that made the first big entry into the United States, you might say, on the West Coast in the kind of 50s and 60s. But lately, it's been another tradition, Vipassana meditation / you might say mindfulness meditation, that I think which found a beachhead on the East Coast originally, yes. and then spread west. But that the term mindfulness, which is much more associated with Vipassana than Zen, I would say, is what's been getting all the press. And yes. First of all, do you have like a theory as to why that is? Is it just that one happened to come first and then the other came and it gets its day in the sun? Or is there something about the times we're living in, the challenges we face, that makes this idea of mindfulness, at least as being understood in the West, a really useful thing?
Yeah, good question. And it's interesting to think about the history of our reception of Buddhism and our interest in it. The original interest in Buddhism, as you say, in the 50s, 60s, Zen Buddhism, was really in a kind of a radical form of Zen. It wasn't in Zen meditation so much as a sense of living in a wild and right up front way, of seeking deep experience. That morphed into the Zen of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, where Zen was very much about meditation and discipline and so on. So a totally different thing, going from undisciplined, anti-discipline to total discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons that Zen hasn't maintained its momentum, is that it requires that discipline. You know, it's a very disciplined set of rituals that, along with a number of scandals that have gone through Zen communities, that didn't help. Tibetan Buddhism with the Dalai Lama in the 80s and 90s, I think, was huge. Partially because the Dalai Lama is so attractive a figure, just, wonderful human being. You can see his enlightenment. But then mindfulness in the Vipassana tradition just began to make sense in the most pared down terms, simply being awake, being aware, being open to understand what it is you're seeing and feeling and perceiving, and what it is inside of you that's adding to that. Those skills we recognize are applicable across the board. No matter who you are, what you're doing, those skills don't even have to be religious. Those skills are incredibly valuable. Mm-hmm. So I think that has that sort of sent the Vipassana tradition to center stage currently, and it will keep happening. I mean, the changes will continue to occur.
So, when you said initially the interpretation of Zen was as this kind of like validation of the opposite of discipline, did that have to do with? I mean, it was embraced by like the Beat community, Jack Kerouac, right? Was that just kind of like the message they were looking for? I mean, this was the 50s. There wasn't yet, the big like cause of the Vietnam War for the counterculture to latch on to. So I guess maybe it was a little more of a free-form rebellion. It's
military discipline, really. I mean, coming out of the war, everybody had been organized into the military effort, and then the Korean War. So there was a militant kind of organization and conservatism to American society. And these were artists and poets and litterateurs, musicians who wanted to break through that. And we're talking about a very small group. Mm-hmm. But once we got into the 60s, the spread of that caught on. So anti-discipline.
Did that expectation on the part of the American counterculture actually shape, do you think, the behavior of somebody like Maizumi, who came over here, founded the Zen Center, and was, I guess a rebel in some senses of the term?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I assume that's true. I mean, imagine in the 70s when, for example, the Zen Center of Los Angeles was growing exponentially. And the kinds of people coming out of the 60s who came here from all over the world, and I'm living in Los Angeles, came here in order to study with Maezumi. They were people who were experientially motivated. They were experimenting with their own lives and wanted something unique and different. And Maezumi knew how to tap into that. Even though what he taught was orthodox Soto Zen discipline, and it transformed the lives of these young people out of the 60s and 70s. Still, there was something about him that tapped right into that beautifully. And it was influential on him, too. I mean, it's not that sexual promiscuity didn't happen in Japan, but that the license for it in California at that time, of course, would have been huge. Mm-hmm. Everybody else was doing it, so why wouldn't he?
Right. Okay, so what is it? Let's talk a little about what is distinctive about Zen. And of course, I know there are many Zens. I mean, the more you look into any tradition, the more you realize how hopeless it is to characterize it. But that said, I think you raised the question in your book, is there something about Zen that makes it easier to separate the ideal of enlightenment from the ideal of good moral conduct? And so talk about what Zen means to you, and why it winds up brushing up against that question.
Okay. Well, there's a long history here in East Asia before it gets here, but in Japan, there had been a narrowing of Zen Buddhism that was going on in the 19th and 20th century as well, radically focused on the kind of deep concentration in zazen or meditation that leads to enlightenment. And so everything else became secondary to that concern. And so training in a Zen monastery meant training in meditation and really in nothing else. So that might lead to a form of enlightenment that was, while brilliant and incredibly profound, nevertheless had some limitations. And the point of one of the chapters in the book is that the moral limitation was evident in some of the Zen masters who were, of course, brought immediately into the imperialism of Japanese government in the 30s and 40s to orchestrate gathering of young men into discipline and into basically pro-Japanese imperialism. The moral question simply didn't come up for them, mm-hmm. And or when it did, the constraints on them were such that they had to hide it. Very few Zen masters were able to say, "There's something not right about this." Japan was invading other cultures in order to get the resources to be able to withstand Western imperialism. And the moral question didn't come up. So there was, after the war, there was kind of outrage about that. Why didn't Zen enlightenment include the capacity to recognize there was something wrong with us, morally wrong with Japanese imperialism? Well, my answer to that is very simple, that who you become is dependent, in Buddhist terms, on what you've done, on your practices, what you do, what you think, what you say. And those practices shape your mind, as we know in neuroscientific terms. So Zen masters weren't prepared to engage in moral discourse or to think really in deep moral, ethical ways about the problems of the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. And you sometimes hear Zen characterized as having a little bit of an authoritarian streak relative to other practices. Now, is that just because of this? Does that grow to some extent out of this particular period in Japan when it got kind of militarized? Or had there long been this idea of the Zen master? You see these like films of like Zen masters, kind of like, I don't want to say whipping students who are falling asleep while meditating, but like, it's not, it's not the kind of ideal you're picking up at a lot of meditation centers in the United States these days. You don't see a lot of corporal punishment of students by meditation teachers. Is it? I mean, how far back does that go in Zen?
Well, although it comes to height, obviously, in the 20th century, it goes all the way back. I mean, all Buddhist traditions are patriarchal in their own way. So there's that gender issue. But the image of the Zen master in China, where Zen or Chan began, was of this incredibly awakened human being. So obviously, you yield to the Zen master, right? The Zen master is enlightened, and that's what you want as a disciple. So in the history of China and early Chan Buddhism, even the emperor was going to Zen masters asking for teaching. So that they became great authority figures over time was just part of the deal. So that's built into the tradition. But you can see it in every Buddhist tradition and in every religious tradition and in other traditions as well.
Right, and we should say that, in general, I mean, as you're suggesting, Asian Buddhism, certainly going back through the ages, is probably more patriarchal and authoritarian than a lot of Americans might realize, because they've seen this kind of modern Western version, and that can lead to a number of misconceptions. Among them, the idea that Buddhists meditate as a rule, right? I mean, Asian Buddhists, lay Buddhists, it's not about meditation for them. It's much more like what we think of as a regular religion.
Right.
And maybe that. Well, let me ask you one more question about Zen. The other, I think you've touched on this, but there is this. Is there this ideal in Zen of like sudden awakening? Like it can. I mean, it's kind of a paradox. On the one hand, I mean, there are people who say, look, enlightenment can happen at any moment. You're sitting on a beach, blah blah blah. And I think Zen is associated with the idea of sudden enlightenment, but at the same time, there is this idea that you got to work to get to the point where it suddenly happens, right?
Right. Yeah. So huge controversy in early Chinese Zen about whether enlightenment is sudden or gradual. And in fact, it happens before the advent of Zen. And the Chinese tendency is to choose the option of suddenness because the text they're receiving from India had what in China they didn't have, which was the sense that time is endless, reincarnation, rebirth, right? You're not going to be enlightened in this life. It's, thousands of lifetimes from now. And there's an East Asian or Chinese impatience with that idea. As that grew, it got to the idea that enlightenment has to be a sudden breakthrough, just a breakthrough where, although you've disciplined yourself to get to the point where that's possible, nevertheless, it happens suddenly. It's a twist of the mind where it's an intuition that comes upon you. And it happens in other spheres as well. We know in science and in mathematics, the mathematician will work forever tediously, and then boom, sitting on the beach, whatever, right. It breaks through.
By the way, I forgot to ask, do you meditate or have you meditated?
I do and have.
How much?
Boy, it depends what else is going on in my life, but every day, a little bit, or sometimes longer. It goes back in my life all the way into my teenage years.
Really?
It just went out. Where my family volunteered to have the one foreign exchange student in our town come to live with us for the year. Just happened to be, instead of the usual European coming through, a Chinese Thai Buddhist. And she, I was 13 years old, she was the older woman in my life, very influential on me, and was Buddhist. And I saw her meditating one day. I teased her mercilessly about it, but I also wanted to know, and she taught me. And I didn't do it so seriously, but experimented with it until I was far enough into the 60s in my youth to get it going.
And so you've kept with it for pretty much your whole life.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't want to brag about my virtuosity in this regard. There are times when I'm meditating very little, but meditation also, for me at least, becomes something that I do without sitting down and saying, I'm going to meditate. It becomes so deep a part of my sensibility that I'm about ready to go off to class. I'm about ready to talk to you. I sort of just instinctually now gather myself into a certain state that is a little bit more centered, a little bit more aware of self-aware. And so that meditation happens many times every day, even though it doesn't count as a formal, I'm going to sit down and meditate kind of meditation.
Mm-hmm.
But I do that as well.
And what meditative tradition had she come from? So what was your first exposure? Was she? You said she was Thai. So was it?
Yeah.
Was it?
Family was in the Chinese part of the Thai tradition, but yeah, she was Thai, and presumably in this Vipassana tradition, although very rare, as you said, for anybody, a lay woman to be meditating, but people do. They experiment with it. Everybody tries it, even if it's not something they keep going throughout their life.
And in Southeast Asia, I mean, maybe more Burma than Thailand. I'm not sure, but in Southeast Asia, there did, starting like 100 years ago, so there did this tradition of lay meditation. Kind of picked up for reasons we won't get into, but that in that sense, the emphasis on lay meditation in the United States has some authentic roots in China, even though they're relatively. I mean, in Asia, even though they're relatively recent. So, so what you get out of it is in the kind of the mindfulness vein of meditation. Would you say?
Yes. Although when you really get to thinking about mindfulness, you realize there's so many things to be mindful of that meditation can be very different. I mean, you can be mindful of your own tendencies to greed or fear, and you're really engaging in a kind of psychological introspection. You can completely forget yourself and be focused on what's out in the world. You can be focused on neither. I mean, the possibilities are endless, but all of those can be encompassed in some sense within the mindfulness tradition.
Yeah. And I see kind of a relationship in the sense that the idea of focusing on these parts of yourself, greed, fear, whatever, the idea is to become less enslaved by them, right? So, and to become, in that sense, less self-centered, less driven by impulses you might call selfish, not in the sense that we're always talking about greed, but in the sense that they're self-centered. I mean, fear is a self-centered impulse. It's an insecurity about what's going to happen to you. And naturally, we're created by natural selection. We're kind of focused on ourselves. But the connection I'm talking about is that by being mindful of what's going on in yourself, you become, ultimately, the idea is you become less self-centered, less, and that allows you to pay more attention to the outside world in a mindful way, right?
Good. Yeah, exactly. Although there are endless degrees to which you can become self-aware. I mean, there's no end to it. There's no bottom to it. So that focus on oneself can keep going, but in the exact sense that you say, which is to liberate yourself from yourself, especially your delusory, your hateful, angry impulses that have effect on community, have a deep effect on others.
Right. And that brings us back into the moral realm. And I don't you think, I mean, notwithstanding the question of the Zen tradition, don't you think that going back deeply into Buddhism, there is this idea that there's actually a natural connection between enlightenment in the sense of more clearly perceiving what's going on in you and outside of you, naturally makes you a less self-centered person and a morally better person. It isn't just that there is a tremendous emphasis on moral precepts, although there actually is. I mean, there are these 10 commandment-like things that you're not supposed to do, but what really interests me about Buddhism is how organic the connection is thought to be between just enlightenment in the sense of understanding the way the world actually works and kind of moral enlightenment, becoming a better person just almost naturally. As a result of that, it's obviously not guaranteed, and you tell stories in the book that establish that. Yeah. But that is that your take on Buddhism?
Yes, it is. Everything depends on your practices. So if your Buddhist practices are narrow, your enlightenment will be narrow. It'll nevertheless be enlightenment in that specific sphere, but it'll be narrow. If your practices include moral practices, include a whole range of things, your enlightenment will as well. So, and Buddhism is a rich tradition that encompasses all of this. So it's all available. It's just whether a specific version of it is practicing comprehensively enough to take in what we would think of as the most important spheres of human personality.
Okay. But it is possible to use the skills of meditation to become a more effectively predatory person. That's in principle possible.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Okay.
a burglar can use mindfulness to great advantage, right? Attentive to sounds, totally aware of every motion and movement, able to be incredibly quiet, secretive. Sure.
I think they actually use mindfulness training for snipers in the military.
They do. They do. Yeah, to effective outcome. So obviously they're not doing moral training there. They are training in one very specific skill. Stay awake, pay attention, stay focused. That's it.
And that part of it is authentic to the idea of enlightenment, right? I mean, in other words, just the idea. I mean, it seems to me that the idea of attaining a certain calm and equanimity, a certain kind of objectivity in your view of the world. You might say a more clinical assessment of it, but certainly one that's less driven by your own selfish perspective. That's really fundamental to, I mean, if you're looking for common denominators to enlightenment, notwithstanding the different manifestations, this is a pretty common one, right? That you, in some sense, maybe the word detached is the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And no self issues out in its consequences in unselfishness, right? So that if you meditate on your interrelation with other people, and you meditate on all the factors that mitigate against you being a distinct, autonomous, isolated individual, and on your connection to others, then unselfishness is the natural outcome. It just happens to you.
Okay. Now, at the end of the book, you engage in some kind of, I guess, scenario exercises, like what enlightenment might become going forward, what kinds of interpretations of it there might be, which is a really interesting question precisely because, Buddhism is becoming this big global thing. And of course it changes, and you can argue that, well, Western Buddhism, is or isn't authentic Buddhism, but, something that preserves really a fair amount of the intellectual heritage of Buddhism has now spread well beyond Asia. And so it's going to be kind of a force. And so your take on this is interesting. Now, one thing you don't want enlightenment to be thought of, you say, is as a kind of transcendent otherworldliness. Is that right?
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, first of all, how common is that? How common has it been in Buddhism? And secondly, why are you not big on that?
Why am I worried about it? Yeah.
And actually, maybe we should start before that and say, elaborate a little on what you mean by a transcendent otherworldliness. What is that kind of enlightenment like?
Okay. Well, what happened in India and elsewhere in Asia, but especially in India, was a competition between traditions, Buddhism and other traditions, and within Buddhism, different kinds of Buddhism, but Buddhism and the various Brahmanical traditions in Hinduism and later other religions, was a competition over whose great masters were bigger, better, and more enlightened. And so there was a tendency for the prize of enlightenment to keep being elevated in people's imaginations. And so otherworldly tendencies more and more emerged in the history of Buddhism, where otherworldly means that nirvana is a state completely separate from this world. That yes, maybe you attain a state of equanimity in this life, but really nirvana is what happens to you after you die. There was a sense that great bodhisattvas or enlightened beings could do time travel into other universes and on and on. Those images in the competition between traditions got to the point where images of greatness ceased to be relevant as practical models for human beings to follow, right? If enlightenment means astral travel, well, I'm not very close to that. I'm not there yet. I'm not in position for that.
Speak for yourself.
Right. So I think that there are those temptations in the history of Buddhism, although Buddhists always stayed on the ground as well and were about transformation of oneself and one's community in time and space. That tendency is always there. And that has leaked over into Western Buddhism occasionally, especially in Tibetan Buddhism and in Zen Buddhism on occasion. And I think that temptation for us right now is one to be avoided. That there is what we need right now, especially in the current political milieu, are models of human excellence that are very much among us. People who know how to take a stand courageously without personal fear, people who are unselfish, people who work on behalf of the common good, and who do so generously, and so on. So these very human attributes are essential to contemporary and Buddhism in the future as I've projected it. And so that's my resistance to transcendental images of enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking for a socially engaged Buddhism, for one thing.
I don't see how any Buddhism that we can valorize wouldn't be socially engaged. And at some point, if you have any degree of enlightenment, and if that includes compassion, you have to care about what's happening in the world, to our children, to the environment, to everything around us. So, yes.
Yeah. And it seems to me that the threat to that isn't just a kind of transcendental conception of what enlightenment is, but there is a tendency as you do meditative practice and get more and more deeply into it. I mean, let's face it, the idea of meditative practice is to some extent allow you to maintain your equanimity and a sense of well-being even under adverse circumstances. That's really fundamental to the teaching. I mean, and fundamental to what the practice from the beginning. And so it can naturally happen that people use the practice to become perfectly happy themselves and become more indifferent to what's going on out in the outside world. Their passion for change, for social activism may be quelled. It's an almost natural product. So I think the issue isn't just for those few people who are near enlightenment, right? I mean, it seems to me a challenge kind of deeply rooted in the practice.
Yeah. There's one more image here that has come up in Buddhism, and certainly has come up in Western religions, Christianity and Islam in particular, that the real action is in some other world beyond this one. And so you can afford to ignore what's happening here because really nirvana is elsewhere. Just like heaven is elsewhere, the world can burn, and if you're going to heaven, you're good. That sense of things is a temptation in every tradition. And it comes along because every act of self-work, self-discipline, self-sculpting entails you're having to step back out of daily activity, no matter what you're doing, whether you're doing art or meditation or philosophy or music, you're stepping back out of the engagement in the world in order to cultivate something. You're practicing. But the point of practice is to be able to get back in the world and get busy. So there is that tension between the pulling back to improve things and open yourself and getting back in order to use it. It comes up throughout every tradition, in fact.
Okay. And just to pause a little on that, this conception of nirvana as this transcendent thing, we should say that, leaving Western Buddhism aside and so-called secular Buddhism aside, in Asia, the idea of nirvana wasn't just to attain bliss in this life; it was the release from the cycle of rebirth. So it was this inherently kind of transcendent thing, and even though most lay Buddhists probably don't have the aspiration to actually attain nirvana in this life, even for them, the incentive structure is much more like the Christian incentive structure than I think people realize, which is that good behavior makes it more likely that you will have a favorable afterlife in the next life.
Yeah, yeah. And that meme was brilliant, going back to its origins in Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and elsewhere. That moral behavior will pay off. If it doesn't seem to pay off now, it'll pay off in terms of cosmic justice. In the long run, you'll get it. So that's been, a thought that's had valuable consequences. I think it's run its shelf life to some extent, insofar as we're dubious about afterlives. But there are certainly other moral incentives to replace it.
Yeah. And when you say we, I guess, I mean, in the West, I mean, there's still a flourishing, just as there are very traditional forms of Christianity, in some sense, you might say theologically conventional and traditional, flourishing in the United States. There is a lot of that in the United States, but there is a lot of that with Buddhism in Asia. But if we're talking about this kind of Western Buddhism and what you call secular Buddhism, you have a good chapter on the work of Stephen Batchelor, who wrote the book Buddhism Without Beliefs.
Yes.
And if you're talking about that, then it is a different set of questions. But you do say something interesting here, which is in thinking about the Asian Buddhist conception of the next life. Of course, the concept of karma figures centrally because the ratio of good deeds to bad deeds will deeply influence how favorable your rebirth is. And you talk about the need to naturalize, I think, or develop a naturalistic conception of karma. Now, what would that be like?
Okay, yeah. Well, I had largely ignored the concept of karma in decades of study of Buddhism because Buddhists often ignore it. But something happened to me that made me realize, hey, there's something really valuable in this central concept. I was out in a country kind of place, and I learned from a tow truck driver that he had an example where a neighbor had done something atrocious to him, killed his hunting dogs, and he was about to go retaliate against this neighbor, basically kill him. But he ran into the one preacher, Christian minister, Protestant minister in town, and the minister could see that something was wrong with him. He was upset, and it all kind of burst out. And in order to explain to this young man why he ought not to go murder his neighbor, this Baptist preacher pulled out the idea of karma. He said, the guy said, well, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And the preacher said, no, karma. And what that meant basically was everybody gets what they deserve, right? So that this guy, having done those terrible things, okay, you'll get it. Don't you do the same thing and also get bad repercussions for yourself. But in order to naturalize karma, a number of things have to be altered a little bit.
Just to interrupt, the preacher wasn't talking about a naturalistic conception, right? He had a belief that divine justice is meted out, right?
Yeah, but the term he used,
was
he
karma.
Didn't say God's going to get you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He said karma. So I said, wow, this guy not only knows about karma, he pulls it out of his inventory of memes in order to persuade this guy not to murder somebody.
Yeah.
So extraordinary thing. Made me realize, okay, there's Buddhism and Hinduism have a concept that's universally applicable as long as supernatural connotations can be whittled down a little bit, that we can use, anybody can use, even a Christian minister can use it. But you have to be careful that it doesn't necessarily have to go with an afterlife, right? Where in Buddhism it's usually tied with rebirth, reincarnation, or nirvana. In Christianity, afterlife and heaven. Because so many people in the world don't really think in terms of afterlife. So, but karma functions without that. Karma is basically the idea that everything you do is sculpting who you're becoming, right? So that your brain state, your mind, your character is being shaped by your thoughts and your actions and your what you say. Everything you do is making you into a particular kind of person, and that's the roots of the principle of karma. And for us to be able to use that term karma to name that sense that we all have about the building of and sculpting of our character could be a resource for the future that's outstanding.
Okay. I mean, there is this kind of belief. There is this idea that what goes around comes around, right? That
Yes.
I mean, the one version of a naturalistic karma is just that people who go around mistreating other people, sooner or later it catches up with them. Now, I'm sorry to say that's not always my observation in the world. I've seen people rise to great political heights. In fact, recently.
Huge.
And huge heights in
bad
spite
karma
of
all kinds.
right, without seeming to be wonderful people on a day-to-day basis in the way they interact with their fellow human beings.
Yeah.
But are you talking about more than that conception that usually what goes around comes around?
Yes, although when I always ask my students, okay, karma, you know what it means. What is it? That's the first thing they always say now. What goes around comes around. And it's to some extent true, but as you say, not always true in our experience. Sometimes corporate criminals will lead wealthy, reasonably okay lives right to the end. Mm-hmm. Sometimes good people will die of cancer for no apparent reason that we can see. So that cosmic justice in this life, we can't count on that. But karma doesn't need to extend to that extent. Karma can simply be that your character is being formed by your actions. So that if you do good deeds, you may not necessarily have good success in your life, but you will be a good person. If you practice burglary or robbery, your character will be shaped by those actions, even if you end up being wealthy.
Okay. So it's the premise is there's something inherently good about being a good person, and that is reward enough.
That is that internal reward. We have to live with that. Although we don't have to live with that in every sense. We can create a world where more and more justice prevails, right? Where corporate criminals are demoted from their status, where people who do great things are given the rewards they deserve. Human justice is a human artifact. We create it or we don't. Or we create these kinds but not these other kinds. It's for us to expand our understanding of justice and put it into effect ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's for us to take care of that.
Okay. Now, kind of related to this, you write, this is near the end of the book when you're talking about, kind of directions the ideal of enlightenment can take and that Buddhism can take. You write, there is an eagerness and a need for a concrete philosophy of life that is now being felt by many within global Buddhism and other traditions. I was a little surprised by that because it seems to me, you go to these, if you go do a meditation retreat or something, they seem to think they have a philosophy. I mean, they give a Dharma talk every night, and there are certainly, these are, it's somewhat some of them are somewhat in the vein of a kind of a homily. They're imparting values. They're giving you guidance on how to live your life. So what do you think is missing in modern Buddhism?
Yeah, well, not that. I think that is there, but it needs to be expanded, right? I think it needs to grow, and so we get to the point where we are helping individuals cultivate a personal philosophy of life by absorbing elements of philosophical tradition and religious traditions from all over the world. I mean, that's our heritage now. We can do what no one in any previous culture has been able to do. And to develop that is a matter of great difficulty. And I think it is being done in Buddhist Dharma centers, and it is being done elsewhere. But more and more people will recognize that that's half of what they need to get in going off into their meditation retreat. It's not just the silent withdrawal into meditation. It is also to embody a kind of philosophy of life that carries them through difficult and good times in their lives. So for us to get back to the point where that's explicitly what we're developing, I think is should be a goal of contemporary Buddhism.
Okay. And when you said, I think you just said something like, we have the opportunity to do that, something that hasn't been done before. What do you mean by that? I mean, is this a special historical moment or what?
Yeah, totally special historical moment. That even in my youth, when I was very young, pretty much the spiritual options open to me were incredibly narrow. We have the whole world traditions available to us now. They are here. They're right here in Los Angeles. They're where you are. They're where everybody is. And that's the first time ever. I mean, there have been incredibly open societies that were demographically mixed in the past, but now the whole world has become a global reservoir of possibilities, and we're no longer as shy about tapping into them as people in the past were. Christian ministers or Jewish rabbis in the past would borrow from other traditions but not be willing to say it. And now they're willing to say it. Here's a Buddhist idea that's good, or here's a Jewish idea that I really like. And to combine traditions and not worry about it because they're all human, right? They're the human heritage. And really, that is available to us in a way that it's never been to any other culture or historical epoch. And it's deeply transformative, or it will be. It's becoming that.
Of course, at the same time, we face a challenge, which is that pretty much all of these traditions have had some of their traditional premises, theological or otherwise, challenged by science, right? So on the one hand, they are all available to one another as resources. On the other hand, in some cases, the intellectual foundation of the resource is by some lights coming into question.
Yeah, indeed, in powerful ways. But our resources go beyond religious traditions, philosophical traditions, now scientific traditions, all of this artistic, aesthetic traditions. In order to regroup what Buddhists and Jews and Hindus and Christians and Muslims are having to do is figure out, to the extent that they're global and contemporary human beings, figure out what it is in their heritage that really makes the grade today. I mean, what is it that doesn't need to run in loggerheads with contemporary scientific theory? It's part of my attraction to Buddhism, is that if you take the basic narrative of Buddhism, you don't have to deny evolutionary theory. There's nothing about it that runs counter to science, even though there are plenty of Buddhists who oppose change. Of course, they're just human beings. But there's something about its basic story that opens into the contemporary world in a very promising way.
Of course, we should say there is, again, in Asian Buddhism, as practiced by most Asian Buddhists, there's a lot of supernatural. Well, you can call it metaphysically exotic, or you can call it supernatural, whatever. But the idea of rebirth, the idea of karma in that context, and there are, they say the functional equivalent of prayers, and they ask for things from divine beings and all the rest. So there is that, and in that sense, the average American's conception of Buddhism has probably been seriously warped by the version of it that has taken root in America. At the same time, would you say that this isn't just a warping? In other words, do you think that there, and I think you kind of said this, but I want to be clear that within Buddhism all along, from the very foundation, there is a part of it that works very well with a modern scientific secular world in a more thoroughgoing way than is the case with other religious traditions.
Yeah, that's right. There are precedents in Asian Buddhism for the same phenomena too. When Buddhism went to China, Chinese culture already had philosophical traditions, aesthetic traditions, political traditions, and so on. So Buddhism in China was shaped as much by those Chinese inclinations and background and culture as they were by Indian Buddhism. And so if Western Buddhism is warped by our lack of contact with Asian Buddhism as it is in Asia, that's actually, in another way, a good thing. It allows us to, Western Buddhists, to not start from scratch, but to look for the elements in these traditions that really work here. I mean, obviously, Gender relations in our world are different than gender relations in Japan, for example. And Buddhism will have to accommodate that. It already has. So that those alterations that just occur culturally and naturally without people even recognizing it to some extent are valuable.
Right. And I think, I mean, another thing that not everyone appreciates is Buddhism. I mean, there is the religion, but for a long time there's been the philosophical component, a very well-developed philosophy that, 1,500 years ago was probably more vibrant than anything going on in the West. And of course, there's Christian philosophy too, but it seems like a lot of that, if you look at like medieval Christian philosophy, was in the service of defending a theology. Whereas a lot of Buddhist philosophy was in the service of defending apprehensions that people had meditatively. Right, and that's a very different kind of enterprise.
Yes, although just to clarify my take on medieval Christian theology, they were acts of defense in some sense, but also a clarification in new terms, right? Mm-hmm. So that Christianity had to be now understood in Aristotelian terms, right, having received Aristotle from the Muslims. And it had to be defined for the current moment. And so it wasn't just a defense of something old, it was a transformation of something old into new circumstances, always going on, and always receiving a kind of updating that is necessary. Same thing occurs in science, right? An old science has to be taken up into the new via controversy and debate. Now, yes, there's a conservatism that we find in religious institutions, certainly in Buddhism, certainly in Christianity, Judaism, and that's something to be reckoned with. I mean, there are conservative values where there are things worth conserving, and other times conservatism is simply holding on to an old world that it can no longer be justified.
And at the same time, we should say that in the modern era, there has been liberal theology in the Christian tradition, which can be very philosophically sophisticated. I mean, Alfred North Whitehead, his kind of process theology is a little Buddhist, right?
It's a little Buddhist, yeah. And there was great dialogue at the height of process philosophy in the West with Buddhists. They were the most of all the kinds of Western philosophy, they were the most able to receive Buddhist guests from Asia and to listen to them and pay attention to what they were saying and to try to find common ground. I mean, they weren't saying the same thing, but the commonalities allowed them to have a conversation.
And what would you say the common ground was, if you had to characterize the common denominator between process philosophy / theology as rendered by Alfred North Whitehead and kind of Buddhist philosophy?
Yeah. Well, certainly the basis of Buddhism in the concept of impermanence, where change is ubiquitous. Nothing is outside of the cycle of change. And all change happens through causal processes and conditioning, and all change is interlinked in settings of interdependency. Those concepts are just universal between science, process philosophy, and Buddhism. But also Whitehead's interest in the cultural side of these realizations too. Right? He was interested in the implications of this for a moral outlook and for a philosophy of life. And not all philosophical traditions in the West have had that kind of openness. Mm-hmm. Some of them are more focused on simply the logic or the analysis of language and so on. But in the high point of process philosophy, that was still an important part of philosophical tradition.
Okay. All right. Well, we're about out of time. I just want to close with another quote from the book and let you riff on it, and then we'll call it a day. But this is more in the way of a prediction. It says, enlightenment in our time will become more communal, collective, and intersubjectively shared than in any earlier epoch. And then you add later, our past traditions of exclusion and otherness are incompatible with a deeper sense of our shared humanity. You want to talk a little about that?
Yes. That one of the breakthroughs in Buddhism and in Christianity and in other religious traditions at a certain time, the actual edge, was that individuality finally emerged out of collective communal religion. And so individual uniqueness was prized, and sort of all-star practitioners in these traditions began to take off. Well, that culminates in modern stark individualism. But we've turned back the other way. Everything about contemporary intellectual tradition is about what we share, right? Our culture, our history, and so on. And I really think that enlightenment will no longer be conceived as simply an individual accomplishment, but will be rather something that a community engages in, a community seeks among ourselves, and that it will have a lot to do with the ability to reach out to other kinds of cultures, other religions, and to include them, encompass them, rather than reject them in otherness. There are a lot of dimensions to this, but I think that's the moral impetus of our time, and I see no sense in which that won't be encompassed in our conception of enlightenment as it unfolds in evolutionary time over the next century.
Okay. Well, from your lips to God's ears, as they don't say in Buddhism. Well, thanks so much, Dale. Again, the book is What is Buddhist Enlightenment, published by Oxford University Press. Really, really interesting book. Hasn't been out long, right?
2016.
Yeah. Which seems like only yesterday.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, and good luck with the book, and maybe you can come back and talk to us again down the road.
Yes, thank you very much. Enjoyed the conversation. Talk to you again.
Me too. Bye-bye.